Hello, bonjour and welcome to your new Bonheur Private Wines video. By now you all know it, I am a wine guy. More than anything else, of course. I've been studying, making, talking about, writing about wine for more than half of my life at this point. Yet, I don't mind enjoying a nice cold beer too. I think beer is also a really fascinating universe, but in essence, it is a very different world to wine. So today I thought we could discuss what are the key differences between wine and beer, since they are, of course, the most consumed beverages, at least in all Western countries. We'll look, of course, a bit at the technicalities on how they differ, but beyond that, we'll consider what difference it makes on how we approach those products, their respective industries, and perhaps even the cultures that are behind them. Let's go. How is it strange to crack open a bottle of beer in front of you right here? I never do that. Well, I'm quite glad to share a glass of beer for once with you. Of course, wine and beer are both alcoholic drinks that are fermented, but I'm tempted to say, apart from that, there's hardly anything in common between beer and wine. It's almost like, I'd say, cocoa or chocolate and cheese. Those two are fermented, they're both foods, but they're very different, right? Wine is, as you know, a fermented fruit juice, grape juice, and yeasts is essentially all it takes to make wine. There are, of course, a few additives that are used in small quantities through the winemaking process to make sure it actually turns out good, but that's very small amounts. It's all fermented fruit juice, basically. Beer, on the other hand, has a complicated elaboration process. It's grained, generally barley, with water and hops. They all have to be mixed up, then heated up to quite a hot temperature to break down the starch into sugar so it can be fermented. Then it's all cooled down, then inoculated with yeast, then fermented under pressure, etc. So there's quite a few things to get through that are highly transformative to the base product, to the grain. Essentially, beer looks nothing like grain. Beer is flavored too, with those bitter hops added and sometimes even spices. While of course wine is pretty much never flavored. Beer is also cheaper than wine, and that's because beer is way cheaper to produce in general. Out of an acre of a field producing grain, you can easily produce about 8,500 liters of beer, while out of an acre of grapevines, about 2,000 liters of wine you can make, so well over 4 times less out of the same acre in a vineyard than in a grain field. And grapevine is considerably more expensive to crop than grain. On top of that, wine also has generally around 12 to 16% alcohol, while beer, as you know, is around 4 to 6%. Generally speaking, wine contains a lot more calories per liter as well that you may not have known. 800 calories per liter for wine, or around half of that, 400 calories for beer. But of course you drink less wine than beer, less amount. For the same standard serving size, a glass of wine would contain around 130 calories here, against 145 if I were to drink that whole glass of beer. Wine is also obviously flat and very acidic, while beer is, as you can see, carbonated. It has virtually no acidity in beer except for the CO2 that creates a little bit of acidity in beer, and beer is bitter as well, while wine generally isn't. So there's absolutely hardly anything in common except that they have water and alcohol, very, very different taste profiles. As I said, hardly anything in common between beer and wine. Or is there? Of course, you already know how beer and wine are enjoyed respectively, so I probably don't need to elaborate a whole lot here, but let's consider a few facts that maybe you haven't thought through or thought about all that often. Beer is, of course, to be served very cool or cold because it tastes disgusting, really. Otherwise, while wine is a little more versatile temperature-wise. Wine can at least last for a few days after opening a bottle, while your beer will quickly become really flat unless you properly seal it really well, in which case maybe it can stand a few days. But wine is a little bit more versatile and it'll last a little longer. Beer is more often than not enjoyed by itself rather than with food, which is probably for two main reasons. Number one, beer has more water in it and less alcohol, so it's more thirst quenching, while wine enjoyed by itself would really hit your nervous system quite hard with a lot of alcohol too quickly to be enjoyable, really. Secondly, beer simply doesn't go as well with food, arguably. But let me explain. Of course, and I enjoy it myself also, beer goes fine with the appetizers, the pizzas, the fast food, barbecues, and a whole lot other variety of foods as well. Of course, it works fine, but beer doesn't really go with the food. It doesn't marry the food's flavor much. It doesn't elevate a dish. It's more you eat something on one side and you drink your beer on another side. While, as you know, wine can really transform a food's tasting experience, and that's mainly because wine has this really strong acidity, possibly, and arguably also because wine has finer flavors. You've noticed that we talk about fine wine, which is generally more praised and expensive than not fine wine, regular wine, and that could be because, generally speaking, fine wine goes better with food. We never really talk about fine beer. We say good beer, we say great beer, excellent beer, tasty beer, not fine beer. Another huge difference in how we enjoy beer versus wine is that, of course, wine ages, while beer sort of flattens and loses freshness of its taste quite quickly. It doesn't age well. You don't age beer, which in turn means that you can't really collect it either. Beer is more for short-term enjoyment. And indeed, talking about short-term enjoyment, this very beer is probably getting a little too warm already for me to enjoy, and it would have lost probably its effervescence by the end of this video. But anyhow, this leads us to thinking, if beer doesn't age, if we can't collect it or cellar it for later enjoyment, it means we can't create and build strong memories with beer as much, at least, as we can with wine. It's harder to create this emotional connection with a beer than it is with a wine. Let me explain. If you visit a wine area at some point, or a wine country, you've been to California, Oregon, Washington, France, Italy, Spain, New Zealand, wherever that might be, well, you can buy a case of that wine and store it, and you're sure to recall those travel memories every time you open and enjoy one of those bottles in the future. The wine of your wedding, the wine of your anniversaries, the wine your best friend had you discover. The wine's ability to age helps us create, then revive all those memories of our past. This is one of the really strong emotional components of wine. I'm not saying you can't have these sort of emotions with beer. I'm sure you actually can, but it's probably not as obvious, not as natural, and you have to really seek this connection with beer. You have to really be into beer to establish this emotional connection with a product. With wine, I would say it comes naturally. Another aspect of the wine culture versus beer culture is the link to the terroir, to the place it comes from, to the local culture. There's a historical element here, at least in old wine producing nations like in Europe. Wine is often linked to a long history, Middle Ages sometimes, like those stories of some wines that we bring you with the clubs that are produced around many centuries old castle, those kind of stories that we love to bring you because we like to bring you wines with those historical stories. There's also a cultural element as well, how the Italians don't make the same wines as the French because they don't eat the same kind of food, or the Spanish because they don't make the same vino to go with different foods. On top of that, wine has the ability to taste of a specific place to taste different from one vineyard to the next, from one village to the next, as Burgundy, for example, demonstrates brilliantly. Beer, as a contrast, is by nature a mix of different things from different places. Grain from an area that produces grain somewhere, and hops from a different area that produces hops somewhere else. Hops, you may not know that, can be really grown in many areas, even around the world, so you have to source them from the Pacific Northwest that produces a lot, or Belgium or Germany, and you have to bring those regardless of where your brewery is located. So nothing to do with the place itself. Plus, to brew a beer, you normally mix different grains and different hops from a whole lot of different areas, because different areas produce different kind of grains, etc. Some whiskies have connection with a place and its history, like in Scotland or Kentucky. But beer is less about the place, generally speaking, but rather more about the craft. The craftsmanship, the process itself is what beer is more about, rather than anything else. And okay, I may sound like I've been bashing on beer a lot here. Well, actually, it's not really my intention. I don't want to sound too negative about beer. I actually love good beers a lot. I love to discover new crafts, new types of hops, new styles, the lagers, the ales, the stouts, the pilsners, etc. Tasting all this variety is fantastic, especially now with this infinite variety and the high quality that came out of the craft beer movement. And beer is just such an enjoyable beverage to have and to share rather simply. It's fantastic for this. I'm all for enjoying beer responsibly as well. But I guess I've been deep into wine for so many years that I can only talk so much higher about wine, which I actually ended up doing here. I hope you didn't find me too biased, which I have to admit, you probably know it, I am. In any case, that was it for me today. Have a wonderful day, and I will see you soon in the wonderful world of wine. Yep, not beer, wine. Cheers.